Listen up. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to the podcast participants, and not to any participant's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. You know, for fun. So lighten up and enjoy. Oh my. Episode 85. Now, dear listeners, Stomping Jen is not with us. I am starting this podcast without my co-host. I don't know what's going to happen. I feel untethered. I feel like a kite cut loose from its kite string. I do not know what to do. But we will plunge forward because we have an incredible guest tonight. We have with us Alaina Macaulay, who is a director of diversity and inclusion. And her Twitter handle is @Alaina Macaulay. And you can find that on Twitter. Now, tonight we are going to have a conversation about race, racism, white privilege, and try to unpack some of those ideas. And I think this is particularly important in light of what's happening around us in the world right now. And this is right now, in case you're listening to this at some point in the future, because it's a podcast, right now is June 1st, 2020. So, maybe this will serve as some sort of historical record after the country has burned down. We will see. But, without further ado, I give you episode 85 of the Soft Serve Podcast.
The Soft Serve Podcast.
Creamy, delicious ideas without the creepy truck. Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, guest, Alaina. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I am doing okay. It's been a tough week. I'm feeling generally kind of demoralized by what's going on around me in the world, I think. But other than that, I am doing spectacularly well. As we get going, there are a few people I want to thank that we usually thank at the start of the show. And I'm going to remind people I'm doing this without my co-host. And I'm feeling strangely like I don't know what to do. But hopefully Stomping Jen will show up and join us shortly. So there's a few people I want to thank that we typically thank and have been thanking at the start of the show since the start of this pandemic 12 weeks ago. It's been a long time.
Sure has.
Yep, and those are the essential workers and the healthcare workers on the front line. So our folks working in the hospital, the people driving our stuff across the country, people working in our stores who are on the front lines. So thank you to all those folks. There's another group of people I want to thank, which are all of the people who are out there in the streets protesting right now. And I'll say, I'll just leave it at that. The people out there who are protesting, I think they are making important statements right now about larger issues going on in society that have been going on a long time, and hopefully we'll talk about some of those. Particularly, I'm interested in talking about issues related to racism, white privilege, things that allies can do to help, especially as we look around and see what's happening out there in the world. So thank you to everybody out there supporting and raising up their voices. Before we roll into our news segment and check in with our guests in a little more depth, I just want to continue to ask our listeners if you are enjoying the show and enjoying the community leaders we've been talking to the last 3 or 4 months. Please share the podcast with a friend. Subscribe to it, download our episodes, leave us reviews. We're not a monetized podcast. You all know that. So you're not going to hear mattress ads on here or the other stuff you hear on podcasts. So spread the good word, please. Without further ado, I'm going to roll us into our little news segment. Alaina, one of the things you'll learn about me is I love bumpers and I love creating bumpers. So here's our news bumper. Oh, wrong one. Here we go. That sounds newsy, right?
Definitely sounds like 90s news.
Yes, that was the idea I was going for. All right, so here we are. We're in week 12 of this pandemic. We have national protests spreading across our country. How are you doing?
It's a lot to process, but, I think we have the right intention and moving forward day by day.
Yeah. Have you been impacted in the sense that you are working from home more? Are you?
I am. I work for a university, and so I've completely shifted to remote work while also homeschooling, while also, trying to just keep my sanity about what's going on in the world. Pandemic wise, as well as, the nation's unrest.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm definitely feeling the stress of working at home now going on 12 weeks. Like I find myself actually missing traveling to the office and the large university where I work also. So I'm definitely missing all of that now and like in a weird way longing to kind of get back to being able to go to a work site. I know that sounds weird. And, at first I was like really excited about working at home and being a remote worker, but not so much anymore. So.
No, I completely agree. All the things you take for granted just in your normal everyday commute. I've appreciated now the privacy that I have of driving 1 hour to work and just being in my own thoughts. But I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah, and my one thing that has really suffered is my podcast listening, and that's just totally unacceptable. As a podcaster myself and somebody who pays attention to downloads, like I've noticed like a significant drop in my own listening of podcasts and also people listening to my podcast. So I selfishly want to get back to normal, I think, for that reason. Alaina, I mentioned at the start of the podcast that you worked in the area of diversity and inclusion. You mentioned you did that for a university. So is there anything more you want to say about that role or that function you fulfill professionally? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the Eisenberg School of Management, which is a business school affiliated with the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Previously, I've also held roles at the director level for diversity and inclusion. But I think a lot of people actually have no idea what that role means or entails. And so I feel as though while I'm doing my job, I'm equally trying to educate people about what my job
Yeah,
is.
and so I know that's I think a question a lot of people are going to have. What is diversity and inclusion, and why do we need this? Like, why do we have to have somebody focused on it?
Yeah, that's every day I get that question. So first, I think let me start out by saying that diversity and inclusion are two very unique and different terms. Although we often hear them together, they have very different meanings. And so diversity literally means variety. And in the human context, it means having many types. And we understand that as being identities and experiences. And so there's a great quote about diversity is counting the heads and inclusion is making the heads count. And so with that being said, like inclusion is our ability to not only come together and have diversity in the room. So again, variety, many types of people, perspectives, experiences, identities, but also ensuring that all the people in that space are involved and valued. And I think that's where my work comes in, is recognizing that, you might be in an organization that is incredibly diverse. You have all types of people doing all types of work. However, how are those people feeling included within that organization, or vice versa? Your culture and your inclusivity within your organization might be great. However, do you have multiple perspectives in the room challenging you and questioning you on how you're serving a particular population? And so that's where my work is really about getting to the deeper questions there about what inclusion, what diversity really mean.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that this is more than, if we don't have somebody thinking about this, it's not going to happen on its own. It's more, I'm guessing along the lines as we really, that there are forces at play within companies and cultures that are working against diversity and inclusion. Therefore, we need to make sure that we have somebody in our institution or our organization, what have you, really focused on this, at all levels.
Absolutely, you're exactly right. And I think that it takes somebody from the outside, perhaps coming in, or somebody in a role that can take this perspective or this lens and say, hey, you know what? This is how this organization has typically run. But have you considered this? Have you considered how this might affect these people, or this group of students, or this group of individuals? And it could be as different as departments, not even just, I think a lot of people think diversity and inclusion is something along the lines of race, but it could be, how are we considering staff in these conversations versus our faculty? And obviously I'm relating this to a university setting because that's where I've mostly done my work. But it goes along those lines, is a lot of my work.
Yeah. And I share, I think, a similar experience in my union work. I've mentioned here on this podcast before, at the large university I work for, I'm actively involved in my union at a leadership level, and diversity and inclusion is something that we have to pay attention to constantly, right? At that level too. So Stomping Jen has joined us, and I feel so relieved, Alaina. I was floundering.
I'm so sorry.
You can ask her. This was probably the worst beginning to a podcast ever, Stomping Jen.
I'm sure it was fine.
Oh no.
Oh, he did great.
No,
It was really fine.
kind.
I just had to crawl under the wire and not disturb the table to join
still,
us on the couch.
You still disturb the table, but it's okay. I'm so
sorry.
happy you're here with us.
Well, I just had to 2.5 hour long meeting. Oh my God.
Yep.
Okay.
So we'll try to be mindful that we're not going to let this grind on forever.
Yes.
I didn't warn Alaina. We've been known to do 3-hour podcasts, but we'll be good to you. I promise. I promise.
Well, it's nice to meet you virtually.
Very nice to meet you as well.
Yeah. So, Stomping Jen, I was asking Alaina about diversity and inclusion, right? And what that means and why we need it. And she gave a really good explanation.
Great.
And I'm curious how you, as a person and a professional, got involved in this line of work and why it's meaningful to you.
Yeah. So my background, and I think I'll start from the very day I was born.
Okay, great.
So I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it's one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. That being said, I was born to a white mother and a Black father who, well, my Black father did not want much of a role in raising me. And so my stepfather's family all immigrated from Mexico. So I grew up culturally Mexican, culturally Italian, Sicilian on my mother's side. And so it wasn't until somebody pointed out to me that I was Black that I realized, oh, I'm Black, And so as a kid, I feel like a lot of my role has always been educating others on difference and what other families look like, what other experiences look like, what my history was, what my background was. And so while I haven't always had the title of Director of Diversity and Inclusion or somebody involved in multicultural affairs or issues, I feel like it's just been instilled at me in such a young age because of my life experiences, growing up very poor in poverty, also talking about the racial components and the ethnic components, also just thinking about the context geographically of where I grew up. A lot of my experiences has been in having these conversations with people and learning how to become comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Yeah, and when you say somebody pointed out to you that you were Black, was that a positive experience, or was that a? I'm sensing there may be something in there that.
No, it was not a positive experience. Okay. So I grew up in mostly, I'll say Black and brown communities. Mm-hmm. So in Milwaukee, again, I was raised mostly by my white mother and then my Mexican stepfather, but we were in a very large Mexican community, as well as a large white community. However, I went to all Milwaukee public schools, which are Milwaukee's just smaller than Boston. It's still a pretty fairly large city. And so growing up in schools where it's very diverse and you're only seeing certain types of people, not necessarily people with mixed identities, mixed racial backgrounds. I wasn't quite fitting in with the Black kids. I wasn't quite fitting in with the Mexican kids. I wasn't quite fitting in with the white kids. And so it wasn't until somebody was like, maybe you're Dominican. And I was like, I don't think that's right either. So I finally asked my parents, a little bit more about myself. And, I continued to question it quite a lot growing up because I didn't feel as though anything really stuck for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And we were talking a little bit before we started rolling the digital tape, and I was sharing with you. I am a white male in my mid 40s, and for most of my life, I think at least prior to coming to large university where I worked in student affairs, and I began to go through diversity training. Thank you, Stomping Jen. I had absolutely no experience or facility or I think perspective for considering people of other colors, and talking about race and identity was something that was really uncomfortable for me. And like I was saying to Alaina before, like I still feel like I don't have the tool set or the tools in my toolbox are not sharp enough to be able to do this effectively. And I was saying I'm probably going to say something, that's wrong or not framed the right way, and it's mostly because I think, at least in the majority white communities I grew up in, nobody ever encouraged us to contemplate talking about race, identity,
well,
racism.
I think that's the issue we're faced with right now, right? I mean, not just right now, but like our whole lives, right? This is the big question out there. We're, as a white community, if you can call us that, as white people, like, are being told, like, listen and educate yourself and allow space for voices to be heard, and not, try to, make excuses for that, that these are the things that we could do.
Yeah.
Now.
And I think a lot of that comes from, as a child, you're praised for being right rather than praised for being wrong. And so we have to like open up and accept that we're not going to be experts in everything all the time, especially if your experiences haven't allowed you to be exposed in those ways.
Right.
And so, I think you hit the nail on the head. If you're discouraged from doing something, or if you're actively not encouraged to do something, you're not going to engage.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's, and I think that is likely, in my estimation, the stifling of conversation about this, at the earliest ages in people, and for lots of reasons. I think maintaining white privilege and maintaining the systems that perpetuate that makes it really uncomfortable for people to even have these conversations. I think that's one reason.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know. I want to allow space, like, so, but I'm a Jew, right? Like, so I have a whole other suite of like challenges and experience to bring to a conversation when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and
absolutely,
that is different. That I've spent my lifetime trying to educate others, and I married a non-Jew, so we have these discussions a lot in our house,
Yeah.
But we all still present as white, right? So there's that challenge too. That's, part of this equation when we discuss it, with the kids and everything. So.
Yeah. And I think that's so valuable. I was telling Sawtooth before you joined us that, my husband and partner is a white man. And so, I think that a lot of the educating he had to do on his own, as in addition to the education that we've kind of had to go through just being together, is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, and I think I was reflecting on what, I've been seeing in the news the last couple weeks, right? We go back, I know he was murdered in February, but it didn't really, I think, come to our attention until, a few weeks back. Ahmaud Arbery, being, chased down by, Southern white vigilantes in a pickup truck and murdered on the street. I'm thinking about, what happened at the beginning of last week with Amy Cooper, the Central Park dog walker who threatened to call the police on Christian Cooper, a black bird watcher who happened to be there, who had the audacity to ask her to leash her wild dog. And then, of course, the horrific video we saw of George Floyd's murder. And, sue me if you want, by those 4 cops, I think objectively you have to look at that and you can't see it as anything less than murder, right? So I see all that, right? And I feel outrage, right?
Yeah.
But I know I post on social media, this is outrageous, but I know that's not enough, right? So, and I think trying to find the words to frame this question the right way. So we see these things persisting, right? They're not going away. I think one of the only reasons we are seeing them now is because we have cell phones, like, right? Because they're not happening more.
It's being televised.
It's being recorded now,
right? Yeah.
Right, and they're being televised. But I think there's something. I think there's something else to consider about, like, what is it about society, our systems, our institutions, that allows so many Black people, usually Black men, to be unjustly and unequally treated for just living their lives, right? And that's the thing that I grapple with, and that's a huge question, right?
Is that even a question?
Do you have another podcast that we can?
I know.
I know. Was that even a question?
I know.
I
know it's too big, but it's like one of.
But the way I see it, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think it's one that a lot of people are starting to ask themselves, and hopefully lawmakers and people, decision makers within their communities. But the way I see it, our society has never dealt with the deeply troubling past like that we've had. And, it isn't something that's happened in my lifetime, my grandparents' lifetime, their grandparents' lifetime. This has started literally prior to our country's founding, and it's uprooted or it's embedded in slavery from a racist perspective. And we've never really sought reconciliation proactively. We see something happen, and that's when we speak out against it. We hear something happen, that's when we speak out against it. And so rather than addressing all of the issues and the ills that we've had historically, we've just waited till people have asked for it. And so as a country, we continually need to be, influenced and persuaded that Black lives indeed matter throughout history. And that's why you see what's manifesting today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, we talk about this a lot. It's like, we've all become so jaded and used to this that it's like, okay, we just move on. We get outraged, and then the next thing happens, and everything just keeps getting swept under the rug, and nobody wants to but unless the majority of people want to sit down and really proactively like engage and communicate and really try to figure it out, the deep roots, like you said, that's never been addressed in this country. Like I think about, again, I'm relating it to my own personal experience with Judaism, which is, that in Germany, they had to go through a whole reconciliation process about what they did. And we've never done that here in America.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a really valid point. And I think we can look to a lot of other countries to talk about the ways in which they've tried to reconcile the ills of the past. And, why hasn't the U.S. been able to do that successfully?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is a point of resistance, right, is when you have so many people enjoying the privileges of systems, right? Whether it is the employment system, healthcare, the justice system, right?
Education system.
The education system.
Everybody's just trying to get ahead, and they don't care who they're stepping on, or they don't think about the people below them. It's like that movie that we watched.
Yeah.
What was that movie called? Where there's like these platforms. I don't know if you've seen.
It's called The Platform.
Yeah. Where it's like the people at the top get to eat as much as they want, and they could, if they wanted to, portion it out and leave for the bottom, but they don't. They eat as much as they want to gluttonous proportions, and so it's like akin to this 1% kind of ideology. And
I'll have to check that one out. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's a little gruesome. I'm not gonna lie. It's a little bit violent, but the parallels to some of this is is there.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I have found, I think, most unnerving, right, especially in the last 7 years since a lot of these, a lot of the unjust treatment of black people being murdered by cops has been made available to us. I think you were saying at Stomping Jen, is the cycle of outrage, right? And the wash, rinse, repeat.
Yeah.
But nothing. We can't seem to get any traction.
Right.
On the problem, right? And
right.
Once, and I'm going to turn to current events here on June 1st, 2020. Once we do seem to get some traction on the problem in terms of people's attention and turning out to protest, you have, and it looks like maybe the tide could turn because there's so much attention on this. You have the government declare martial law, right? Which is my opinion is what happened this evening.
Right. It wasn't actually.
Our president declared martial law.
Did he declare martial law?
I think that's what happened. And I will say, over the last week, he's been evoking incredibly racist imagery. Well, he talked about releasing vicious dogs on
calling people thugs.
Protesters, using coded language like thugs, right? So once we start, it feels like start getting momentum, right? The government really turns the screws to protect all of this white privilege embedded in the system. I don't know. I'm incredibly frustrated because I think that's going to mean more people of color, more protesters are going to die, like tonight and subsequent nights. And this is going to, it will fade from the collective white unconscious, right? Or collective conscious, sorry. And, then we're going to then the cycle will start all over again. Yeah. Unless it doesn't.
You need to break the wheel.
Well, and again, this is only Sawtooth Frank saying this. Yeah. I was remarking to our son Ted tonight, or maybe somebody else, that it would take millions of people descending upon the Capitol, peacefully protesting, hopefully, to make a statement. Maybe that will happen this time. We'll see. I don't know. So I'm really frustrated by the cycle, and I don't know how to break it.
Thank you for that.
Any ideas, Alaina?
I mean, if I had the magic answer, I wouldn't have a job anymore, and we would just all be able to live in peace and harmony. And unfortunately, that's not where we are. I would love to work myself out of a job and say that the institution that I'm involved in is rid of all, issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would love to say that I live in a country that is also able to say that. But, I think what people need to do is to learn what works for them and meet themselves where they are. Because I think, telling, the masses go out and protest, that just doesn't make sense for everyone if they're in a different, spot in their learning or their understanding of what's actually happening.
Right.
So I think it takes recognizing and being really, really honest with yourself about what you're capable of doing and what you're willing to do.
Yeah.
But it's a continuous learning process. And Sawtooth, you acknowledge that yourself, and that it's something that you continually feel as though you're educating yourself on. And I'm doing the same, even as a person of color, it's so much for me to understand how to navigate these systems and change them.
Yeah. And I think another thing, I'm a bit of a science geek, and I like data, and I think looking, where we talked a little bit about how we're coming through the other side of this first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, and when you look at the populations that have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus and COVID-19, it's very clear that that the systemic, I think, inequality in terms of healthcare have impacted people of color because they are the population that has, I think, suffered the most hospitalizations and deaths from this virus. And a lot of that is because of, I think, under access to healthcare, and on an ongoing basis. And I think like that is a data point that is staring us all, that has stared us all in the face. And I don't know.
Yeah.
And I asked that question again, what can we do other than, ask the questions? And I don't know if I have the answer. Education, right?
Education, listen.
Single payer healthcare.
Space for people's perspective.
Well, I think increase access to healthcare, not just for people who have jobs and can
afford the best care possible and don't have to go to the ER and expose themselves to other illnesses.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Things of that nature.
Right.
And I think listening to what the experiences are of people, because we're going to diagnose and prescribe, but until you actually know what these people are going through, and I say these people in all walks of life, you have no idea. And I'm saying, like, any of us, none of us know what somebody else's individual struggle or, obstacle is. So, I think we need to do a lot more listening.
Yeah. And I just want to check myself because I said healthcare for people who have jobs. And it's not just about people who have jobs, right? That's not what this is about. It's, we have Medicare in this country, right? For, I think, for people who, who are poor, right? And cannot afford employer provided health insurance. But I think the point I wanted to make is regardless of your employment status, right? Everybody should get access to, I think, quality
as a basic human right.
Healthcare as a basic human right. Thank you, Stomping Jen. And that's really the point I wanted to make.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, no, because I'm listening to myself and to the implicit message, right? Which could have been that people of color don't have jobs, and that's why they couldn't afford healthcare, and that's why they got sick. Right? Like I'm like monitoring.
You're dissecting the words as you're saying them.
I am, and I'm like monitoring for like the own biases embedded in my speech.
That's important.
I know. I just wanted to cycle back to that and like check myself on
He's
that.
also a narcissist, even though
what do you mean?
Trying not to be.
How dare you?
Sorry.
No, but I think that's a good point.
What?
I'm like really trying to think about what I'm saying and how I'm saying it. I think.
Oh boy.
No, it's good. And I mean, it's not even just about employment. It's also about where a hospital's located and who's in those hospitals working in them. And,
right. Transportation issues. Can you get to the hospital? How far away are you from the hospital?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've mentioned this idea about white privilege a few times, right? And I'm not even sure I know how to define it.
Is there a definition of white privilege in your line of work? Is there?
There's quite a few.
Okay.
It depends on what you're reading and the theory that you're using. But yeah, there's quite a few working definitions. Some of them stem out of, Black feminist thought and literature. A lot of them stem out of just, colorblind ideology. And so yes, is a definition of white privilege. I think that the way people interpret it, though, always surrounds like a really negative connotation, and just privilege in general. Anytime you acknowledge that somebody might have privilege, nobody thinks that's a good thing. And I think that's where we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And what I want to say about it. So if there is a kind of median concept of white privilege.
Yeah.
Like, how does it contribute to racism in our country? I mean, because in my mind, when I think about, again, not knowing any of kind of the different textbook models of what it might be, in my mind, white privilege is the kind of the systemic and institutional advantages that white people kind of get wrapped in just by virtue of their skin color, right? That allows them to get a leg up, for lack of a better term, or have advantages that other people don't necessarily get.
I think that's a good start.
Yeah.
And I think that way of thinking is also what trips up a lot of people in getting behind and understanding why it's something we talk about so frequently. Because when you think about it from like, oh, because I'm white, I have this privilege and now I'm so much better than, or I have all of these advantages, or, I've never struggled. And I think that's what people hear when they hear white privilege, when in actuality, privilege literally only means that somebody has an advantage in some way.
Yeah.
We're just saying that because of your race, it's not one of the mechanisms leading to your struggle. And so, the way I try to frame that with people in a lot of the educational type sessions that I do, or a lot of the workshops that I lead, is that privilege is also afforded to you on multiple dimensions. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a gender thing. It could literally be, Jen, you mentioned being Jewish. That is not a dominant ideology within the United States. And so that has been not necessarily something that people are afforded privilege within the United States. However, being Christian identified in the United States is something that does afford you privilege. Mm-hmm. Same thing with being light-skinned, able-bodied. Mm-hmm. That's incredibly important to recognize. Like, how often do you think about curb cuts? Mm-hmm. How often do you think about the ability that you have to navigate a building? One of the things I do with students sometimes is use the example of left-handedness, because I think it's one that softens some of these discussions, especially whenever we hear privilege. We're typically talking about it in gender, race, classism, and things that are really sensitive to people. And so when I talk about it, I try to go to left-handedness, because who's really going to get offended there? And so, how many times do you think about the can opener you're going to use? Or how many times do you think about the baseball glove that you're going to use? How many times do you think about, a baseball bat or the stance that you're going to take? And granted, I'm a sport person, so I'm thinking about it from that perspective. Mm-hmm. But, even like driving a car, do you shift with your right hand? Well, now you're shifting right with your non-dominant. And so, I just think about it from the perspective of, you're not going to think about those things unless you have somebody in your life that is left-handed. And so because you haven't had to think about it, it's something that you don't necessarily need to concern yourself with. Because I'm a person of color in this country that has often had, I've been exposed to racism. I've been a victim of racism. I've been also a victim of many other things based on identities that I had. That doesn't necessarily mean that I don't hold privilege in other ways. I'm highly educated. I am a born United States citizen. I have many friends who are not born in the United States. And so I just recognize that privilege has so many other dimensions, and it's not just talking about whiteness that is important.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's one I often forget, right? And as I hear you talking, like, I'm remembering, a few episodes back, we had Ramblin' Blind Josh Pearson on here to talk to us about ableism and, kind of accessibility and another dimension on the kind of privilege spectrum. So I think that's a really good point. Mm-hmm. And I think one of you said this before. I can't remember. if it was you, Alaina, or you, Jen, I often hear people say, "I don't see color," or "I'm not a racist," and I think when people say that, they might think they actually believe those things, right? But I think holding those ideas, right, or not having the ability to challenge those perceptions is really harmful, to people of color in society. And I'm going back to one of my first student affairs trainings that I did, and there was somebody, another he's much younger than me, but another white male who said, well, I don't see color. Everybody's equal in my eyes. And then, we got some explanation about why that's not really a good idea to think that way. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that whole perspective of, like, everybody's the same, and I don't see differences.
Well, yeah, I promised my husband that I wouldn't come on here. Same with the white privilege definition. I don't want to try and use like all this academic jargon, because I feel like that's when people lose it. But I do want to just kind of like reference the tripartite model, but I'll break it down really simply, I hope.
Sure.
In that it's one, when you say you don't see color, unless you are actually colorblind, that's just not true. And so it eliminates a very important aspect of your identity. So if I said, for example, to my spouse who is a man, I said, I don't see you as a man. I don't see you as anything. I feel like you would be pretty emasculated in that way, right? So like, to say that you don't see color, I think really devalues the impact of my race on me and how I navigate the world. And so again, I'm not trying to bog down with like the academic pieces of it, but with the tripartite model, there's 3 different levels of how individuals are categorized and grouped. And so at the very macro level, like, we are all human, right? Hopefully we can say that we are all living because we are humans and we are in this together. Then at the next level, it's recognizing that we have various identities or experiences that might group us with some, but not with others, right? So for example, again, I'm a woman of color. My experience as a woman of color may be different than a woman who is not a woman of color. But my experience might also be very different than a man of color, right? And so thinking about how we categorize ourselves in those ways. And then at the very micro level is the individual. So because I am Alaina Macaulay and I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I have these parents and I have, like my genetics and all of that other stuff plays out, that is the individual experience and the individual person that has all of these experiences in the world. And so going about and saying that one big piece of my identity has not impacted the way I navigate the world is really just, it's really colorblind. Yeah. It's not saying that you don't see color.
It like negates that
absolutely
idea that it negates part of your identity, I think.
Right.
Like if I said, Jen, I don't see you as a Jew.
Right.
Would you feel like, how would you feel?
Yeah, exactly. It's, it's like that's part of your identity. So by saying, I don't see that part of your identity, like this, it's inauthentic, really, I think is
it's
really
saying it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, just to relate an example from our personal lives, years ago, there were experiences we had where people were telling us that, certain decisions we were making may not be Jewish enough, right?
Right.
Or, it didn't.
Well, the different levels of, orthodoxy that you might have within your own religion, like,
right.
And
yeah, and how I responded was trying to do a perspective checking where, okay, to somebody who is more Orthodox than you are not
right.
Jewish enough, right?
Right.
They would not even consider you Jewish.
Right.
right? And I don't know. That was my attempt at trying to get them to see that, not by denying us our interfaith identity, that could be turned around
right
on them. It's really, it's a matter of,
I think it's
perspective, and people get to own, their
who
own
they
identities.
are. Yeah. Who are you to tell me that I am not this?
Right.
thing?
It's no different than if I negated that you are Jen and you are Sawtooth.
Right.
It's omitting one huge aspect of your identity or who you are.
Right.
Yeah. So that's another thing that I have found particularly frustrating, and I've confronted in various leadership contexts, is white people who tell me all lives matter, right? And
Which they do.
yeah,
Yes.
is there I'm wondering for people who are having trouble accepting what the Black Lives Matter movement means and why it's important. Is there a framing mechanism you have that could help those people? Because I feel like there's a lot of them out there still. Hopefully none who...
I have many of them in my own family who, again, coming from a very multiracial upbringing. I have many people who have all sorts of political perspectives as well as, beliefs and what they choose to support. But I think the best analogy I've seen and I've heard, and I hope that people, can understand and resonate with, is the one about the burning house. Are you familiar with this one?
Yes.
I love it because I think it just puts everything in perspective. Like people who say all lives matter aren't saying that all lives, or people that say Black lives matter aren't saying that all lives don't matter. It's just, if you are a fire department and you go into a community and one house is on fire, you're not going to spray down every single house. Even though all of those houses are important, you're going to spray the one that's on fire. And currently in America, Black lives are being brutally murdered in the streets. And, things are happening to people of color that are only happening because of their race and their skin tone and being profiled in many of these ways. It's not to say that it's not also happening to white people. It's just disproportionately higher in the Black community as well as in, other racial minority groups. And so I think that's where right now the fire needs to be put out. But we're not taking the time to address why it's on fire and how we can resolve it without wasting all of our resources on a lot of these other areas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sad to say. I really, it's so frustrating for me as somebody who not only lives this in my everyday life, but then also putting it into context of the work that I do. It's like there's no escape from advocating in this way.
Yeah. And I think the narrative that was successful for me in one of the, it was a pretty high pressure situation. It was right around when I think Trump had just gotten elected, and I remember this person just like at a table. I'm trying to be careful how I frame this. At a workshop we were at, just made this declaration. It's
that all lives matter.
Yep, all lives matter, and we don't need special movements for people. And
why would we need that?
Yeah, and I think I didn't know the burning house
metaphor
analogy, I guess, or metaphor. So I tried to explain it. Well, this is a community that is being disproportionately impacted by systems and institutions, and in a really damaging, deadly way. I mean, trying to call attention. This is you. If it helps you think of it as Black Lives Matter too, right? You know, that, I don't know. That was my feeble attempt at the time.
Yeah.
To explain it to this person, but I don't think I got through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sadly, we don't always get through.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we can start with the man in the mirror, right? Like,
yeah.
Do the education on ourselves and then try to impart the wisdom on the people that we can discuss and have open dialogue. Yeah. And
so you just said something I want to ask you about is you don't always get through. We don't always get through, right, on anything in our lives. But I think this is important work that can have, I think, deep impacts in people's lives and in communities like writ large, right? If we're able to successfully advocate for diversity and inclusion and work cultures, right, that can improve the workplace, right? And when you run into situations where you don't get through, I can imagine that is incredibly discouraging. And how do you keep going?
How do you not lose hope?
How do you not lose hope? Thank you,
Is that what you're
Jen.
trying to say?
Yeah. So glad you're here. You help bring the human element to this. Thank you.
I appreciate you both so much. This is so great. I think that's a really good question. And at this particular point in time, I've been asking myself that a lot. How do you not lose hope in what you don't see hope in, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, so much of what I do is, again, tied to my own identities. And so when you don't get through, it almost feels as though somebody's rejecting you in a way. And so, I'm grateful to have a lot of support in at least the organization that I'm a part of, my work institution. And that's been absolutely so validating to see a lot of allies come and support me, at least in my immediate circle. I know, UMass is not perfect, but they certainly do try. And I feel that. But, it's hard to not feel like when you have not successfully, mitigated a situation that includes racism or bias or prejudice, that it's almost an internal failure, because it is so personal. And so, right now we're living in a time where it doesn't seem like things are going to change. So I've just been doing a lot of R&R on the side to try and protect my mental space as well.
Yeah. What do you like to do to relax?
Well, I used to get massages, but the parlors are closed.
Oh, get this, Alaina. Stomping Jen bought me what was it?
12 massages.
12 massages.
A year's worth of massages.
Like a year's worth.
For the holidays, this last holiday season.
And I haven't gotten to use one of them.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you're going to get, a 24-hour massage once this is over.
Oh, man.
All on my feet, too.
What? No.
Yeah. I'm a big fan. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I like the foot to be massaged.
No. So you like massages. What else?
Actually, I'm guilty of trying to watch reality television.
Oh, what's
it's not something that I've ever really engaged in, even when I was like a teenager and reality TV was really big. But I feel like in order to escape just the happenings of the world, I've been watching really bad TV.
Do you have a favorite reality TV show?
I think I'm embarrassed to say.
No, you cannot embarrass.
I'll tell you. I'll embarrass ourselves. Our favorite is Big Brother, which is on every summer.
See, I feel like I grew up with Big Brother, so now it's not.
Yeah.
It's not exciting because my parents watched it and it was just on.
Yeah.
But I've watched Too Hot to Handle.
Nice.
Which I thought was absolutely hilarious, but horribly misogynistic, and just had all of these weird elements to it. Love is Blind.
Mm-hmm.
That one was a good one. Actually, I like that one. Jessica was horrible. I think that was her name.
We haven't watched those two.
Yeah, we don't know.
Oh, please watch that. I mean, maybe not. It is really quite trashy TV, but no. Reality TV.
So years ago, we talked about this before on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
There was a show on Fox like 20-something years ago that one summer, it was Temptation Island. It was on Fox. It was on. And then they brought it back last year on like USA or something like that.
And they made it trashier.
They made it trashier, but it wasn't quite the same.
It was still good.
It was ridiculous.
Oh, it's the worst show.
Yeah, so we love really trashy.
But yeah, if you like trashy TV, Temptation Island is the best.
Ugh,
yeah, it's so
bad.
Good. Yeah,
I'll keep that in mind for sure. I don't try and watch it all the time, but I mean, I do. I probably read more than I watch TV. But
So you need it. You need I mean, there's so much crap going on. It's like, every day I think we wake up and we're like, what's in the news this morning? Like, what horrible thing happened last night? And so you need that kind of like brain candy, I think. Just turn it off, turn off the thinking part of you and just watch like mind numbing nothing.
Yeah, things that don't make you think.
Yes, it's a huge part of self-care, I feel like.
Yeah. But how do we make the case to people that diversity and inclusion will make society better? Like that is I mean, it makes sense to all of us, right?
Right, I know. But
it's that person who just, for whatever reason feels threatened, doesn't.
So they have it. So this is.
Go ahead.
Right. So you
Jen.
work in this field, Alaina, but I feel like these people have a perspective that has been drilled into them. Some of them years, like that book that Joshua Michael Stewart recommended that we read. What was the name of that book? About the South, like poor people in like Appalachia and everything. It's like
Hillbilly Elegy.
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's a great book.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that book, I mean, it's like it's a different perspective where you have this collective like consciousness that like builds around you, and how do you break that bias? You have to educate yourself about what's happening around yourself, like you have to challenge those biases that have been built. You have to, first of all, you have to recognize those biases, and then you have to challenge them, and then you have to educate yourself. And that's like the only way to break the cycle. So it's like almost like an alcoholic or somebody addicted to something. You have to recognize that you're an addict. You have to want to change. You have to, I don't know. I mean, that's a lot. That's really burdensome. And I
tell me about it.
I'm like thinking about you as I'm saying it, like, oh my God, what a job. It's like,
I don't know who said this. Maybe it was Mark Twain who said the cure for racism is travel. Somebody said that, right? And I think the idea about that, right, kind of trying to extrapolate it to what he's really meaning was the idea to that is that exposure to other or to people different from you with different backgrounds, with different lived experiences, people who look different than you, or it is exposure that will begin to break down barriers. But then again, I also recognize like exposure can be dangerous to certain people too. Like
I have two thoughts when you say these things, right? So like you grew up in Milwaukee and I grew up in New Jersey, but basically New York City, the tri-state area where, it was like very diverse. It was half Jewish, half Italian. Everybody moved out of the city and like moved to like the area I grew up in, so I moved to like white bread Massachusetts. And then I live in this like liberal bubble here, and then I think about, sorry, that was like one thought. It didn't really go anywhere. It was just more of like a
context setting
or whatever. And then I always remember this, the story that you told me about when you went to basic training and you met that black
my friend
soldier, your friend,
Waddington. Yeah,
that you both like had grown up in like different contexts.
Yeah,
and you had never.
So
go ahead.
All right,
Sorry.
I'll tell this real quick. I mean, and keep in mind, I was 18 at the time, right? And like Stomping Jen said, I grew up in a community that was like 99.9% white. Prior to joining the Army at a young age. I left the day after I graduated for high school. Part of that was for, economic reasons. Part of it was to escape my household. So I left right away. Got to the Army, and I began to be exposed to lots of people who I'd never met before, right? Black people, Hispanic people.
Diversity that you hadn't been exposed to before.
Asian Pacific Islanders. There's a lot of Filipinos.
Yeah, we get the idea. Go ahead.
Lots of different. Yeah, thank you, Stomping Jen. You're keeping me on track.
Just get to the point. Get to the story.
Is this that halting, rambling speech that person criticized me for?
Yes, probably.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for that review, by the way. I appreciated it. It was brutally honest. But anyway, so I'm digressing. So I ended up in South Korea. That's where I was stationed. And I was being sent on a month-long field exercise with a group of people. And at this point, I hadn't been there that long, and I didn't have many friends. And one of the people I was going to be assigned to go out in the field with was this black guy named Waddington. That was his first name. I won't say his last name.
Okay.
I'd never really talked to him before, and we kind of bumped into each other in the comic book store on the base. And I was reading comics. He noticed I was reading comics. I noticed he was reading comics, and we kind of sidled up to each other and said, we began talking. I don't know how, but he goes, "I got to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He goes, "I'm terrified of white people." Right? And I said, "Okay." I said, he said, "I've never really met any before coming to the Army. Where I grew up, I didn't know any. And, my mother told me, X, Y, and Z. And, so we began talking about our different backgrounds and experiences. And we became really good friends.
Mm-hmm. What did you say
really
back
close.
to him?
I said, I think I said I'd never really met any black people before.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we kind of had this moment where I think we both realized we didn't,
Well, if you don't expose yourself, if you don't leave your segregated little bubble, if you stay within the community that you're used to, like you just said, the travel and exposure and opportunity to expose yourself to different viewpoints.
But I think what I didn't see at the time, was he probably had lots of reasons to be afraid of white people that I didn't understand because of how I grew up and because of the privilege I was wrapped in. Right. To me, that was at the time, as an 18-year-old who, had no real lived experiences beyond where I grew up.
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh, really? You're afraid of white people? Why?" But, kind of now as a 46-year-old man, I get it. I've lived long enough and have seen enough to understand why somebody would think that, why he would, have those viewpoints.
Yeah.
But I think that was one of the, I think, first experiences in my life that got me to begin questioning, what it means to be a white person, and even though I probably didn't consciously recognize it at the time, it ignited something in me about questioning my own privilege, I think. I don't know. Hard to know, but it's those little experiences, I think along the way. And, for me...
Again, I think you had to be open to it, which was part of your process.
Yeah, and, and it's interesting for me, if I hadn't joined the Army... because of economic reasons, and other social reasons, I would not have met people different than me.
Right.
And formed really close relationships with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is, that's a good example, I think, of how, travel and exposure, can open up the world of differences to you. But
it
go
can
ahead,
also
Alaina.
close them off. And I think that's, to Stomp and Jen's point, again, you have to be open to it, because I think a lot of times some people will travel and they'll see anything that's different from the experiences of their own as wrong, rather than just a different way.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not to say, you know, travel is bad or anything. I'm a huge proponent for traveling. I used to work with international programs fairly, you know, often, and I've led international trips with students. But again, I think a lot of it takes some cultural awareness to recognize that anything different isn't bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
No, it's true. And it's, you know, even when this pandemic started and there was a lot of xenophobia and like backlash against the Asian American community, like it's interesting. Like we send our kids to the Chinese school and like all their teachers are, you know, Chinese, and
Yeah.
there was a lot of, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm trying to say. What am I trying to say, Satu?
Xenophobia.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, you know, when we decided to send them there, how old is Ted? He's 13.
Yeah.
He's been going there since he's in kindergarten. So, you know, there wasn't as much xenophobia at the time, specifically directed at, you know, Chinese people. I think I have felt that ramp up a bit. I'm more conscious of the fact that, you know, we have a president who appears to hate the Chinese and hate Chinese people and hates immigrants, and is perpetuating these damaging narratives about them.
Yeah.
You know, damaging and untruthful narratives. And yeah, I found myself more defensive when I'm explaining to people why we're sending them there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, one of the main reasons, Alaina, that I enjoy sending our kids there is because they're exposed to diversity, which they would not have gotten had they gone to our local public school system, which is predominantly white.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. Because it was an important value for us to expose them to diversity. I don't know. I'm not trying to like pat ourselves on the back or anything either. I'm just like, you know, like I just think about, you know, like I feel like we're more open to, you know, having these discussions when we talk about like, how do you break down doors and like, you know, you have to want it. Like I'm trying to loop it back to that conversation where, you know, you really have to kind of like recognize and want.
Well, and back, you weren't here, I think, when we were initially when I was initially talking with Alaina, but we were talking about the difference between diversity and inclusion, right? And just having them go to a school where there are lots of different types of people, right? May not even really be enough, right? It's how the different perspectives of the different students are included in the classroom, and how participation is encouraged amongst you know, different people in the classroom. And I don't have any real evidence that their school does that.
Well, they're an integration for what's their new motto? It's like a engine for integration, because they have a wide geographic regional reach.
I mean, I think the intention, right, is probably good, right? But I think you have to be mindful of how you're thinking about making sure. I think the different
that they're not segregating within their own classroom.
I mean, maybe
they're
that
actually mixing with
I mean,
people.
Maybe that could be happening, but I'm just saying you have to be. It's the inclusion part of diversity and inclusion that's just as important as making sure you have the numbers on a piece of paper. Am I getting that right, Alaina?
Yeah, for the most part. And, you know, I think it goes again to intention is great. If you might have great intentions, but the execution of that might not necessarily be where it needs to be.
Yeah.
Which is again why we have rules like mine to make sure that, you know, people are thinking really intentionally about this, and including various voices in the execution.
Yeah. And so, like, shifting to like action steps that people can take, people who might be listening to this, like what can we all do to, you know, help disrupt the cycle these cycles of racism that we see, institutional and otherwise. I know this is like a big thing to bite off, but like, what can people who mean well and want to make a difference do? Specifically, like I'm thinking about white allies.
Well, I think one, recognizing that there are white allies is important, but there's also a lot of not white allies or white people who are not allies, I should say. And so I think what white people can do in all, wherever they fall within that is talk to other people. I think a lot of people of color are tired of having some of the same conversations about race that they've been having for generations and centuries at this point. And so, I think it takes white people to also be having these conversations and educating others. You may not always have it right, but at least it's something. There was this woman who is I wasn't even friends with her on Facebook. I was a part of like all those Facebook community groups. And she had posted something that I just had never seen before. And she said, I am a white woman and I really want to step up in a way that I've never done before. And so one thing that I see in the area, and I've talked with a couple of friends about this, is that Black people are tired of defending their stances within social media. So if you go out and tag me in any of the posts that somebody is, critiquing what you're saying or devaluing what you're doing, I'll step up and I will take over that conversation. And I just thought that was a really interesting perspective because I'd never seen somebody do it. Granted, she might not respond in the exact same way that I would have. Granted, I'm also somebody that does this every day. But I just felt it was nice to not have that burden necessarily. I think also too, Stomp and Jen, you mentioned just looking in the mirror and saying, what can I work on myself? And how can I continue to do this within my community? So whether it's in your friend groups, whether it's in, the, communities that you're a part of within your local cities and towns, whether it's calling. Right now, obviously, a lot of the protests are about police brutality. So if it's calling local police departments and just asking, what are your policies and how do you, address these things so that we can ensure that we're proactive and nothing like this does happen within our spaces. If it's something that you don't want to happen across all races, then it's something you should be questioning. So I think those are just really simple things that you can do. I think also just showing up and saying that your support, reaching out to your Black friends and colleagues. I can't tell you how many people I've actually had text me since I said that's important. So there's so many different ways to get involved. There's so many different ways to reach out and say that you're an ally and to support. But saying it isn't enough. If you truly feel compelled to do something, I really encourage you to do so. And I'd be happy to work with anybody that listens to this on, perhaps a mechanism to figure that out. I absolutely, totally believe that, there's a spot in this movement for everyone.
Thank you.
That's well said.
Yeah.
So you hear that, people?
Yeah.
There's stuff to do.
Yeah. We got a lot of work to do, people.
Right. Look in the mirror first. Right? Stomping Jen.
There.
Right, Alaina? Look in the mirror. I'm going to. I feel like I can improve.
Yeah.
I really do.
Well, I had...
There's things I can do better. I can do more.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah. So two friends, they want to start a very small book club. We're going to start reading some materials. And
what materials?
I think we're getting How to Be an Anti-Racist. Is that the name of the book?
I don't know.
That's one that just came up on our recommended list. Yeah. I just led a bunch of book groups on What Happens If I Say the Wrong Thing by Verna A Myers. That's a really simple, easy read. And it has some action steps and questions in there for people.
And I think that, I don't want to go back to this and have a whole, I know it's getting late and have a whole other long conversation about this, but I think that is one of the challenges. I was saying to Alaina at the start of this is, at least I'm only speaking for myself, right? I want to be clear about that. Like, I'm not here trying to speak for all white people and representing the voices of all white people. That's not it. I'm talking about my own experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I had, and I said this a couple of times, like, I was not given a toolbox
Right.
with which to learn how to talk about and navigate, issues and ideas about race and identity and racism. And it wasn't until I was like in my mid-30s that I began actually doing work in this area.
Right.
In the sense that I did any work at all in it, but that I began to actually get training and learn stuff about,
Yep.
this. And so I think that there's a lot of people just don't even have the tool set, and having conversations and even doing the work of beginning to confront some of these concepts feels like walking through a minefield to people. And they're afraid, like the book title you just mentioned, Alaina, like, what if I say the wrong thing?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm convinced I've probably said the wrong thing. Like this evening, like I'm sure I, could have said things better or differently, or, exposed my.
But you're willing to be brave enough to have a conversation. So,
Right.
So what other resources are good ones to start with? You mentioned,
I think a really good one on privilege is Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack.
Okay.
That's like, I don't know, it was probably written in like the 90s. It's like a pretty foundational piece. Mm-hmm. And it goes through all of the things that a white woman has not had to consider based on her experiences. And I think that one's really, that one hits home. Literally anything by Kimberly Crenshaw or Patricia Hill Collins is good. Mm-hmm. There's, and it depends on what stage you're in too. Yeah. Like the one that I recommended, it's a beginner one that we use with our faculty and staff in Eisenberg, as well as the larger UMass campus has this entire book club initiative. And I think that one it's so easy. Verna A Myers is just fantastic. And she lays it out for you in a way that's like, as a person of color, these are the things that led me to my biases. Right. I'm going to work through them with you. So yeah, again, I think it depends on where you're at. I mean, I could definitely recommend some stuff if you're a little bit later on.
Yeah.
But I don't want to bog you down with all the theory books.
No, I mean, that's a good start. I think, for people that are interested, we'll link to them in the show notes.
We'll drop them in the show notes, people.
And, we can start the long road for people that are really serious about engaging in dialogue. And
well, thank you for having this conversation.
Yeah, thanks
with
for being
us
willing to speak with us.
Setting aside almost an hour and a half of your evening to talk to us.
No, I appreciate you all for providing the space. I think it's so important. And the more that we have these conversations, the more that people can equip their toolbox with what they need to engage. Yeah. Because again, if we're too afraid to say something, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah. All right. So do you want to wrap up Stomping Jen? I mentioned to Alaina, we do like to talk, and we talked a little bit. I learned some interesting things about your TV viewing habits. So we do like to just take a few minutes to talk about, at the end of our interviews and at the end of the show, talk about like how
what we watch,
what we're watching, what we're listening to. Do you have any interest in hanging around for that? Or you can bail too if it's too late. It's fine.
If you'll have me, I mean, all my family's in bed.
Okay. So.
Oh, he's playing his bumper.
I warned Alaina about my bumpers.
Oh, you told her all about the bumper?
Yes, she knows.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I just wanted to mention Stomping Jen and Alaina, this one movie we watched last night.
Yeah, it was ridiculous.
It was ridiculous. It's called The Wrong Missy.
I just watched that.
Did you?
Did you like it?
I forced my husband to. No, it's along the lines of like the bad shows, but it was number too trending in the US when we watched it.
Yeah.
It was absolutely ridiculous.
And I kept looking over at Sawtooth and he was like, do you want to turn it off? I'm like, well, it's so bad. I feel like I have to keep watching it.
I know. But Alaina, Stomping Jen kept looking at me like I wrote and directed it. Like she was accusing me of something.
No, it was so sophomoric in the humor. I mean, it's just, I think we've become, I mean, this was like straight out of like Adam Sandler primetime. It was Happy Madison Company.
Yeah.
Like it was so out of his playbook from, way back when. And I think we've gotten very accustomed to this golden age of television. We watch pretty serious shows, I think, for the most part. So when we watch something absolutely ludicrous like that, I'm just like, oh my God.
It was funny.
It was funny.
It was fun.
It was ridiculous.
It was light humor.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I was looking for. So I wasn't entirely disappointed, but I was just like, this is entirely predictable.
Yeah.
We know exactly what's coming.
Yeah.
It was kind of gross.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
it was like survived.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But the woman, I'm forgetting her name. She's just like a brilliant physical comedian.
I know, there was so much physical comedy in that movie.
Oh, she was so great. And she did so much better than what Chris Farley did for David Spade. Like David Spade, he always played the straight man to like Chris Farley's like wild, crazy.
Yeah.
But I thought she was so much better and funnier.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just loved it. It was hilarious.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything else recently, Alaina, that you would want to recommend to people? Movie, show?
So it's on Hulu, Little Fires Everywhere.
I haven't heard of that.
I read the book first, and I'm a reader. And then I watched the show, and I would say both are good on their own terms. Having read the book, obviously it never matches up once you actually watch the show, but that was a fantastic show. And I think it touches on a lot of the elements of race and poverty that I think would be interesting to some of your viewers that might have been interested in this conversation today.
Cool.
Okay, we'll check that one out. And what are you reading? You said you're a big reader. Are you reading anything right now that's interesting?
I just finished this book called Someone Knows. It was like a impulsive, like last minute, I'm in the store and it's a book on the shelf.
Yeah.
But it was okay. It was just really a different type of perspective than I typically read. I read a lot of like D&I type texts. But this one was like a childhood murder, and now they were going back in time to figure out, like what was going on. So it was a good book though.
Cool.
That's awesome. And you actually bought a book in a physical store.
I can't do screens.
Yep. I've got to reward you with this.
I don't like Kindles.
Yep.
I don't like electronic reading.
I fall asleep easier with the Kindle.
It hurts my eyes, to be honest.
I don't like it. I like holding a book in my hands.
All right. Let's see. Stomping Jen. We started watching this show on Amazon called Upload, which is kind of silly and ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. But it's light. It's like a really good way to end the day.
Review.
Like,
yeah.
So we're Upload.
But we finished this show. That's an older show that you're obsessed with right now.
I know. Do you like dramas, like intense psychological, like character dramas?
I really do. Yes.
All right. So I'm going to recommend this show to you called Patriot. It's on Amazon. Yep. It starts off, and you think it's a spy thriller. Right. And it has it's wrapped in the packaging of a spy thriller, but it's about so much more. It's about relationships between parents and children. It's about commitment. It's about internal motivation. It's about depression. It's about anxiety. It's about PTSD.
Wow.
It's about, what else, Stomping Jen? Friendship.
Friendship. It's really good. It's
love,
only 2
marriage.
seasons. So if you if you know going in it's only 2 seasons and there's no more because it's an old show.
Stomping Jen will tell you the first 4 episodes, I kept turning to her and being like, do we really want to watch this?
Yeah, and then he's obsessed with it now.
I can't get it out of my mind now. I cried at the last episode.
He's been listening to the soundtrack.
Because like part of the show is like the character, he writes these songs that are incredibly literal about the stuff that's going on in his life. And they're just like the craziest, but also most poignant songs. Mm-hmm. It's the craziest thing.
Yeah.
But I love it. I cannot recommend it enough.
Yeah.
And I hope if enough people watch it, they'll make a 3rd
they'll
season.
They'll renew it. They'll pick it back up and make another season.
I'm talking it up.
Yeah.
All right. Upload. I mean, Patriot.
Yeah.
And upload.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else, Alaina, you want to tell us? Music you're listening to? Anything else you want to recommend? What else can we know about you?
I am a fur mom recently. That's probably the only cool thing.
Oh yeah. What is the fur baby?
We just we adopted. I don't know why I said that. Yeah. We adopted a puppy from a rescue right over the border in New York. And
what kind of little puppy? Do you know?
He is a lab mix based on just patterns and things like that. But he's a lab mix. He is currently going to be 17 weeks on Wednesday, and we named him Ozzy Brutus Macaulay because he's black. So Ozzy, like Black Sabbath, and Brutus was his rescue name. So
nice.
We're pretty pumped.
That's exciting.
And our 7-year-old loves him.
Oh my gosh.
Are you a Black Sabbath fan by any chance? Is your husband?
I think we both are in our own right. I definitely have like a lot of different tastes in music. Again, diversity because of everything I've been around.
Mm-hmm. The reason I ask is I don't know how this happened. I love Ozzy. I love Black Sabbath, but I had never heard the song Planet Caravan.
But how did you never hear that song before?
Planet Caravan. You must listen to it, Alaina.
Oh my gosh.
It is the most incredible song.
I can't believe you've never heard it before.
I wish I could play it now. I don't have a device hooked
up. You don't want to have the sound maker for that one.
Whatchamacallit, they do a cover of it.
Who does a cover of it? Anyways, jot that down. Planet Caravan.
Oh my Lord.
You'll love it.
What's the band that sings that? I can't think.
What band?
Pantera. Oh my God. Pantera.
What about Pantera?
Pantera does a cover of Planet Caravan.
They do?
Yeah.
I might be able to pull it up here real quick.
All right. Alaina doesn't want to hear it.
No, she doesn't want to hear this. You're right.
All right. It's 10:30.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. No, we've taken up
It is 10:30.
We've taken up
like
too much of your time.
Exactly 10:30.
All right. So that's for the puppy. Good job. Adopt, don't shop.
That's true.
Right?
Yes.
Adopt, don't shop.
All of our animals are adopted.
Okay.
Shopped.
So this is how we typically end it. I'm going to hit this button and we're going to hear the music and you can just hang up whenever you're ready and we'll say bye. I want to say thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me.
I cannot tell you how much I've appreciated having this conversation. I hope people will learn something from it. Want to say thank you again to all of the essential workers out there who are continuing to work through the pandemic. And as we reopen the country, I said earlier, thank you to the people out there in the streets raising their voices.
Yes.
I think that's really important.
Just wear a mask.
This is from Sawtooth. This is from Sawtooth only. Resist, please. Now that we have martial law declared against our citizens. Anyway, sorry, I won't go down this road.
Yeah, you're going down a rabbit hole.
All right. Other than that, download, subscribe, leave me a review about how horrible I speak, please. All right, we won't go there. Stomping Jen, any last words?
Bye now.
Okay, Alaina, we'll give you the final word.
I appreciate what everybody is doing, and I continue to hope for the best moving forward in this country. And I thank you too for allowing space for this conversation.
Thank you. That was the final word. Bye now.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed